Hello everybody, welcome back to my crochet school series. We've reached the final episode. I'm going to be showing you the most basic version of it as I can of how to make your first wearable. I'm going to draw it out a little bit for you here in case you are a visual person like me. We are going to be making a sweater that literally just consists of two rectangles, one front, one back. A ribbed band, if you remember how to do that from the last video, and it's just going to be long sleeves. I'm going to show you a really easy way how to do that. With cuffs and a ribbed neck. I am going to be using multiple colors for this because I'm trying to use up leftover yarn that I have versus buying new. If it is easier for you to just get all the same color, that's totally cool, but just so you know, mine is going to be a few different colors. So we're going to be working this vertically. So we're going to chain on the vertical line, and we will be working to make the sweater as wide as we can. I like to do it, this is just easier for me, this is how I'm going to show you. Obviously do whatever is more comfortable for you, but I find that it's easier for me to get the length right first versus doing something that I think is as wide as I need it to be, and then it turns out maybe it's too big or too small. So this is just the way I'm going to show you. Obviously customize this to whatever way works best for you. Okay, so the way that I'm going to show you how to do this, instead of writing out a pattern for all different sizes, is I'm going to show you basically how to figure out what size you need. And if you've seen my how I draft my crochet patterns video, it's the same process, but in case you haven't, I will walk you through it. So I have figured out I want the length of this sweater to go from my shoulder to just about where my belly button sits, because of this band that's going to make the sweater a little bit longer. I'm making this one not quite a cropped sweater, but not like a super long oversized one either. So it's really up to you how long you want this to be. For me, I want this to be about 18 inches long. So I am going to start by chaining 66. And I'm only giving you the measurement just so you can kind of compare size if you need to. The way I figured this out is I just made a chain and held it up to myself and decided if it was too long or too short or just right. Okay, so once I've chained my 66, I'm going to chain 3 to be my turning chain. Then we're going to be working with double crochets because we've already learned that. So I'm going to double crochet in the 4th chain from my hook and just double crochet on down. See, I lost the end of this yarn inside the skein, so all of this came out. That happens to everybody. It's one of my least favorite things, but it just happens sometimes. My best advice when you're making your own pattern for the first time, especially if this is your first wearable ever, is just to keep holding it up to you as you go along. After I've done this first row, because doing your first actual row of stitches will stretch out your foundation chain a little bit. So even though I know that that 66 chains works for me, because I've already started the other side of this, I started out way too big. I made it much longer, and then by the time I started working these first few rows, it was a lot longer than I wanted it to be. So keep just holding it up to yourself, keep kind of trying it on as best you can along the way. I will also say that as much as I hope you've been practicing before you come to this step, you know, like I said, I've been crocheting for a really long time, but I still end up making things that something isn't quite right or something I don't like, and I have to pull it out and redo it. So don't be discouraged if this first wearable doesn't turn out quite right and you have to try it again. Like, that still happens to everybody sometimes. So okay, once I've reached the last chain, I'm gonna hold it up to myself to make sure it's the length I want it to be, and it is. So now I will just chain 3 for my turning chain, turn. Some people will tell you to do the chain 3 before you turn or after you turn. As far as my experience, it doesn't really seem to make a difference, so it's kind of just your preference. I usually do my turning chain before I turn. Now I'm going to crochet. This time we're crocheting, our chain is going to act as the first stitch, so we are not going to go into this loop that the chain's attached to. We're going to go into the next one. And I'm just going to do double crochets back and forth, repeating this row until this is as wide as I want it to be. So if you want this to be a more fitted sweater, it could be a little bit thinner because this does stretch. If you want this to be like a boxier, oversized fit, then I would go a little bit wider. But it's really up to you. Okay, now that I've got my front and back pieces, it's time to stitch it together at the shoulders and up the sides to make the arms and neck hole. I'm just going to be slip stitching these together. Now the way to figure this out, we're going to start with the neck hole, is you're going to come in from the shoulders, but make sure that you leave enough room in the neck hole to fit your head through. When we do the turtleneck part, it's going to kind of cinch it together a little bit so that it fits more fitted on your neck, but you don't want to go too tight and then not be able to get it over your head. So as usual, I usually just hold this up to myself and kind of decide where I want to put it. I usually will go kind of like level with my ears, if that makes sense, like kind of down onto my shoulder, and then just sort of figure out where that's going to be. So for me, we're going to go, and we'll go a little bit shorter. I'm going to do about 9 rows in. So I'm just going to make my loop. Stick through both layers and slip stitch together. And if you're having trouble with this, I would go back to the previous episodes where we talked about how to stitch things together with a slip stitch and how to crochet down the side of a project, because that's going to help you kind of figure out how many stitches you need to have. So I'll do this starting from the outside, going in on both shoulders, and then the same goes for figuring out the armhole. Is I'll hold it up to myself again and kind of see where I think the armhole should be, making sure I'm going to leave enough room like for my armpit and be able to put my arms down and not have it be too tight or have the seam be too bulky. If you're having trouble kind of making decisions on that, you can always take a sweater or even just like a t-shirt or something, just something that fits similar to how you want this to fit, and hold it up to that and kind of use that as a way to measure how high you want this to go. How far are we? 2, 4, 6. And again, as always, after I've done this part, I will put it on and make sure everything is fitting the way I want before I move to the next step. Okay, so I've got the shoulders and the sides stitched up. I ended up taking a few stitches out from the shoulders. The head hole was just a pinch too small, so I did 8 rows in for each shoulder, and then I did 36 stitches up from the bottom for the sides. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to leave this inside out and we're going to get started on the armholes. Now, like I said, I'm using scrap yarn, so I'm doing this in different colors. I'm probably going to try to use black yarn for the sleeves, but that is notoriously hard to see what you're doing. And very hard to show up on camera. So I'm going to start this with this light colored yarn just so that it's a little bit easier for you to see what I'm doing. Let's start on this side so the contrast will be nice. I would actually love to do one sleeve in this purple, but I don't have enough, so we'll see what happens. These stitches where you've joined are probably going to get a little bit stretched out. They already are a little, and just from moving it around, that's okay. I'll show you how to kind of close that up really nice. So I usually start my sleeve in the next stitch over from the armpit just to keep that from getting even more stretched. So let me zoom you in here so you can see what I'm doing. There we go. So I am going to start by making a hoop on my hook and going into the next chain from the seam, slip stitching to join, and I'm going to make a chain as long as I want my sleeve to be, minus a cuff at the bottom. So I'm going to bring it to maybe like right here if I want the cuff to cover my wrist. And again, it's up to you if you want this to be like a long one that kind of covers most of your hand, if you want it to be a little bit shorter and have the cuff kind of come almost like 3/4 length. Totally up to you, but just remember we are going to add that cuff at the end. Okay, so I have done 60 chains for the sleeve. I'll mark that on my little drawing here. I've actually turned this. I decided I want the purple to go this way, so it doesn't really matter. Just so you know why I'm crocheting the other direction that I originally started. Okay, so now that we're ready to start the sleeve, we are going to do half double crochets for the sleeve. You can do double crochets if you'd rather not change stitches, but when we get to the end, I'll explain why I prefer to do half double crochets for a sleeve like this. So I've chained my 60, then I'm going to chain 2 extra. Then if you remember, if you saw the last couple of videos, a half double crochet starts the same as a double crochet, where we yarn over, place our hook through the chain, then we're going to yarn over, pull through once, and then yarn over, pull through the 3 loops on your hook. So this is in between a single crochet and a double crochet. Now if this technique that we're going to do once we get to the end of this row feels a little bit too complex for you, that's totally fine. You can do the sleeves separately, but I would caution you against that if you want to do a fitted style sweater. That really only works if it's going to be an oversized sweater. That was some of the mistakes that I made early on when I first started making wearables, is if I did like the neck piece separate or the sleeve separate or the band at the bottom separate, it's only going to be, as your final product is only going to be as stretchy as the seam of that slip stitch that you do to join them together. So if you're doing a fitted sweater and you attach your neck piece separately, now your head has to try to fit through that tiny hole, and same goes with sleeves or like a hem at the bottom. So this technique that we're doing, kind of joining the sleeve to the piece as we go, is going to let it keep that stretch. So if you want this to be a little bit more fitted like mine is, it's going to stretch, like the whole garment's going to stretch together, and it's a lot more comfortable to try to deal with, and you shouldn't have any problems getting it on and off. Okay, so we're getting to the end here. So the way that we are going to attach this, we want this row we just made to line up with the edge of our sleeve. So what I'm going to do, whoops, not that way. I mentioned that these 2 stitches are going to, where this seam has joined, are going to get kind of stretched out. To keep that from stretching further, I want to make sure I'm going under both pieces of yarn of that stitch. And I'm going to slip stitch this under 2 of the next chains. And see this little bitty gap I have here? If I do this with double crochets, that gap is going to be really big, and I personally don't like the way that looks. So if you would rather just do double crochets for this whole sweater, that's fine. Just know that if you do the sleeve like this gap is going to be quite big and noticeable. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to take these out and do that again just to show you one more time. So I've reached the end of my row, and now it's a little bit easier to see what I'm doing because I'm not working in that seam. But I'm slip stitching into the next 2 rows to join, then in 1 more chain, so a total of 3. Then I'm going to skip these first 2, yarn over and start my next row. And I will continue that all the way around. And when I get back to where I originally started, I will just slip stitch with this row to kind of make that seam, and I'll show you how to do that when we get there. Okay, so I've got my sleeve finished. I've had to add another color. If you remember, I said I was trying to do this with my leftover yarn. Well, I keep running out of colors to use, so this is much more color blocked than I planned, but it still works for our purposes, at least for now. So once I've reached the end of this row, and if you finish your sleeve up at the armpit, that's totally fine. The process of this is the same. We're just going to slip stitch to join with the other side of the sleeve. And then just like we stitched up the sides, I'm just going to slip stitch up the sleeve and tie it off at the armpit. Okay, so now that we've got the sleeve stitched up, we're ready to start the cuff. And you're gonna do the same process for the hem of the sweater and for the neck. So because we are crocheting down the side of this, I'm gonna do a row of single crochets all the way around just to make it easier when it comes time to do the cuff. This step is not required, but I would recommend it. So just like we've done before, we're gonna do a row of single crochets around. Then just like when we started the sleeve, you're gonna chain the length of the cuff. I'm gonna make 8 stitches. Then I'm gonna single crochet. That one stitch was my turning chain, so I'm doing 7 single crochets. Then just like we did with the sleeve, I'm gonna slip stitch to join. Then because this is a row of single crochets, we only need to slip stitch 1 more to start the next row. Then to give it a ribbing effect, I'm going to do the back loop only single crochets. If you remember how to do this from the previous video, you are just going into the back loop of the stitch instead of underneath both. This is optional, obviously, but I like the sort of like contrast of the ribbed hem and cuff and neckline as if this were an actual knit piece. Then I just chain 1 and turn. Come back down again, slip stitch once to join, slip stitch 1 more, start the new row, and continue on. And this is what my cuff will look like. And this is going to cinch in this sleeve a little bit. Right now, this sleeve looks very wide for my wrist. Doing this with the back loops is going to bring that in a little. If you want this to be a nice like baggy oversized sweater, I would not do the back loops. And if you want this to be even more cinched to your wrist, which is what I generally prefer, you can do this same exact thing but with slip stitches, and it will turn out like this. This I think looks really nice with the slip stitches. It's like nice and stretchy but fits to your wrist. The only thing you have to be aware of, which I actually ran into problems with this when I started, is not making your gauge so tight that you can't get your crochet hook into the stitches. If you start having a lot of trouble getting your hook into the loops, you need to loosen up your gauge a little bit. So either one of these will work. You can see how much this like cinches in that sleeve. So it's really up to you which look or what kind of fit you're going for. But you're going to do the same exact process we just did for this with both sleeves, the neck hole, and the bottom of the sweater for the hem. So I'll meet you back here when we've got all that done. Alright, so it's all done. I ended up doing the single crochet on the neck and on the hem. Like I said, this turned out very color blocked. And then I went with slip stitches for the cuffs. So now my last step is to my least favorite part, but some people love it, so I don't want to turn you off of it immediately. But it's tying off and weaving in all the ends. Alright, made it to this point. You did it. You made your first wearable. I'm not sure if your sweater turned out as chaotic as this one or not, but I hope you're happy with it. I like how this turned out. I really like the kind of color changing in the sleeves and in the neckline. It ended up being pretty cool. If anybody has any, I should have said this for all the videos, but if anyone has questions or anything, obviously I'll do my best to answer them in the comments. I really hope you enjoyed watching this video and taking part in this series. I appreciate you checking it out. Once you're feeling ready to take on other projects, check out my playlist of other crochet tutorials and videos. Thanks so much for watching this one, and I'll see you next time.